The candlelight flickers. The straw mattress rustles. But it's not just sleep that stirs beneath the covers. In the 1700s, nighttime wasn't restful, it was a battlefield. As you drift off tonight, prepare to enter a world where bedbugs weren't just pests, they were nightly tormentors. Close your eyes if you dare, but beware what crawls in the dark. Love unraveling the strange truths of bedtime in history. Hit subscribe, like this video, and tap the bell icon to stay tucked into the coziest nightmares of the past. Tonight, history bites back. You arrive late, as many did who moved through a city that never really slept. Not in the modern sense, but in a pulsing, restless way that made the air feel worn and reused. The lodging house is narrower than you imagined, tall and a little stooped. Its brick front rubbed black by years of coal smoke and the rubbing of shoulders and hands. Inside, the steps creak in a tone that suggests not only age, but specific stories. The porter with a limp, the maid with the habit of pausing on the second landing to catch her breath, and the endless feet of travelers who climb in search of a cheap bed for the night. You carry a small bundle and nothing more, because anyone who knows this city knows that a bed is never yours to carry. What is yours is your readiness, your patience, and your tolerance for small discomforts that, when built into rituals, make up daily life. When the mistress of the house opens the door to your room, you are already cataloging details, not from nervousness, but from ordinary habit. The way light pools around the window, the smell of the fire's last coals, the bedstead against the far wall, tall, wooden, and slightly proud. The bed is not a single object, but a sequence of materials layered into a kind of promise. A promise that you know in your bones is never fully kept. You test the frame with your knuckles and feel the give of ropes beneath the faded tick. If you don't know rope beds, you learn them quickly. Ropes threaded side to side across the wooden frame in a lattice. Supporting first, a coarse sack stuffed with straw, the palliasse, and then a heavier sack filled with feathers, the feather bed. Altogether, it looks softer than the floor and warmer than the chair, and that is how you measure comfort almost every night of the year. You press your fingers into the linen at the corner and feel where the seams have thickened from repeated washing, the cloth turned and darned, a sturdy repair that tells you the household is diligent enough. The ropes are a little loose, as they often are, because any bed slept on by many people over many nights must be retightened with a bed key. You can picture the motion, a simple twist and lever, tightening the ropes until the bed holds you up, like a firm handshake. A bed like this works against the cold and against the thin walls. And it works against the draft that finds you no matter where you put your head. If you draw the hangings, the heavy curtains, you make a small room within the room. Dark and warmer by a few degrees, because in winter you hoard warmth as if it were food. The hangings look handsome at a glance, a bit dusty at a second glance, and then inevitable at a third. Almost every bed with pretensions to comfort has them. They grant privacy when a room might otherwise be shared with a traveling stranger, or with a servant allowed to sleep on the floorboards. They also set a stage for the small creatures that choose you the way the city chooses everyone. You pull the curtain back with care, not fearing, but acknowledging. The wooden testers and posts are carved, and carving means grooves, and grooves mean hiding places. The bed is not dirty, it is ordinary. What you face is not filth, but a city creature too adapted to the furnishings of human life to be dislodged by shame or scrubbing alone. You think about what the people of this house think about every day. The routines that keep vermin in check, if never away. Monday, most likely, is washing day, which means kettles boiling on the range and water hauled up the stairs. And in these rooms, the air heavy with steam and the smell of lye. The laundress will know where to look without being told. She will peel the sheets and the pillowcases back and pinch along the seams with strong fingers. Searching for the telltale roughness of eggs or the faint pepper of droppings, she will. Open the window and beat the feather bed at the sill, and the feathers will blow out in little gusts that make the street below look like it is snowing for a heartbeat. She will loosen the ropes, tipping up the palliasse to peer beneath. At some hour in the afternoon, she will pour boiling water along the joints. A method of both practicality and ceremony, because you learn early that if you scald the corners, the cracks, the crevices, and you smell the wood give off a living scent, you may have the upper hand for a time. You are not thinking of all this because it is dramatic. You are thinking of it because you have learned to be practical. Bed bugs are not a matter for horror. They are a matter for planning. They like seams and shadows, and they like warmth. And there are 100 seams and 1,000 shadows in any room that has known human bodies. You have heard every suggestion, and by now you know which are worth the trouble. Scouring the bedstead with hot vinegar and salt has a kind of sense to it. A sour solution makes the wood surface less hospitable and perhaps catches the pests out from their hiding. Fumigating the hangings with smoke or the burning of sulfur has its place, though the smoke clings to fabric and leaves a scent that outlasts the victory. Oil in the cups under the bed legs can make a moat if you can be bothered, and if the legs are true and the floor is level, which in a house like this is a matter for negotiation. The mistress of the house has surely paid for such things before, though she will be careful with coin. Even when you cannot remember any particular names of apothecaries, you can always find someone who claims that a bottle in his keeping will drive the insects not only away, but from memory, the truth. The kind you whisper to yourself only in the quiet parts of the night is that you cannot banish them entirely. Not in a city where people and goods move constantly and furniture travels from shop to house and house to shop. And everything is second-hand enough times to have lost track of its first home. The lodging house mistress bought this bedstead from a broker, who took it in exchange from a family that traded up for a slightly larger bed in a slightly better neighborhood. The mattress tick, repaired and stitched, has a long life that includes a riverside warehouse and a stint in a military store. Every stop along the way adds its own small population, and you do not remove them by wishing. You remove them by patient work, by the kind of care that might seem tedious if it did not save. You sleep. You look along the cornice of the room, and there are cracks in the plaster where it pulls away from the timber lath. Ordinary cracks that get widened by temperature and damp. In those cracks, you know, are small, flat bodies wedged tight until the hour when you begin to breathe more warmly and the room becomes a map they know by instinct. Travelers are vectors, and that is a word that will not be invented for a long time yet, but you know the meaning by experience. An in-bed sees a dozen bodies in a fortnight. A lodging house bed sees more. The coach stops along the main road are a parade of sheets and blankets folded and refolded, hung on lines behind the kitchen, smelling faintly of smoke because everything in the city smells faintly of smoke. Men who carry bundles carry insects in the seams. Women who work in great houses carry them home in the ruffles of their caps or the gathers of their gowns. Sailors bring them from ships. Apprentices bring them from workshops. Even a judge can find them in the seams of his traveling cloak. There is an underground network of creatures that moves without maps from cupboard to cupboard, along the edges of skirting boards, under door frames, up chimneys. You know this because every once in a while, in the middle of the day, when the room is bright and you are folding your shirt, you find one scuttling along the back of a chair, and you are reminded that light is not a total defense, merely a discouragement. You prepare the bed not because you think you'll rest easily, but because preparation is dignity. You draw the mattress aside and run your hand along the wooden slats, feeling for the gritty signs that tell you where to pour the kettle. You loosen the bed rope just enough to permit a small shift of the frame, and you make a note to ask the maid for a bed key in the morning. You lay out your shirt at the foot, the one clean garment you have saved for sleeping. Because clean linen is the difference between tolerable and unacceptable, the boundary you hold even when you cannot control. The broader conditions of a rented room. You do not make war, you make a pact. Tonight, you tell the invisible city, you will not devour me entirely. I will give you the 2 hours before dawn when I sleep most deeply. Between now and then, I will keep the candle at the ready and the blanket tucked tight. These are the reasonable bargains of a London night. The house itself has a rhythm that is almost soothing once you accept it. Below you, you can hear someone stir, a cough that is practiced and dry. Across the landing, a door closes softly, and you imagine a servant setting her shoes neatly by. The hearth down the street, a watchman calls the hour. Not for you, but because the city requires time to be called, and you are one of the many who happen to hear it. You think of the kitchen at the back of the house, where water stands ready. In a pail and a long-handled pan hangs beside the hearth. It's brass round and slightly dented. The warming pan is used on cold nights to pass hot coals between the sheets to take the chill out of the linen. A small luxury and a practical step, because warm linen is less shocking and invites quicker sleep. The pan must be moved quickly, and the coals must be shaken out, and then the sheets aired for a minute, because if you rush it, you scorch the cloth and risk a spark. Every household has some story about a bed set on fire and a scramble to save the feather tick. Because feathers are dear and smoke clings to everything, and the neighbors will talk. You snuff the candle to a nub. The darkness moves close, but the hangings turn it into a private night, a manageable darkness with an edge you can touch. You know the first signs. There is a moment when your skin seems to become a little more attentive, when the slight brush against a hair becomes a signal, rather than a nothing. You do not scratch yet, because scratching tells your body that the skin is under attack, and you have learned that the quieter you lie, the better your chances of falling asleep between irritations. You breathe deliberately, letting the mattress hold your shoulders. You think of the rope lattice beneath you, how it distributes your weight. The expression about sleeping tight and not letting the bed bugs bite drifts through the mind of anyone who has ever heard it. Then or later, and you accept it not as a truth about language, but as a truth about intention. Tight ropes make a firmer. Firm beds are easier to sleep in when the body is tired. There is a logic there that feels steadying. Even if no proverb actually keeps an insect at bay, you itch, and if you are honest, you also think. You think about the wages of the maid who will come in the morning to sweep and tidy, and how she is paid weekly in coin and sometimes in cast-off garments, and how she must stretch that pay to include a bit of soap for her own washing. You think about the price of coal, which climbs and falls with the season, and the way the mistress of the house has learned to calculate it against the needs of guests. You think about the difference between a straw palliace and a feather tick, and how the city's wealth separates sleepers by softness. You wonder about the provenance of the feathers, whether they were once the weatherproof covering of geese kept along the river, plucked in season, washed, dried, and sold in sacks by weight. You consider how the palliace is filled with straw saved from harvest, how it must be changed now and then when its smell becomes too much of the field and not enough of the house. It is not a meditation on economy in an abstract sense. It is simply what rises to mind when you lie still in the dark and count the elements that make this bed what it is. There are remedies you have tried and remedies you have decided against. The burning of herbs in a pan, which makes a pleasing smoke that hangs in the air and smells better than many things. The rubbing of the bed joints with turpentine or vinegar, which seems to do something, though the insect's capacity for survival is notorious. The oil motes in dishes beneath the bed legs, which can work in principle, but only if nothing touches the bed frame and provides a bridge. Which is harder to manage than you think when your blanket wants to trail or your coat is hung too close. Boiling sheets is effective and always recommended where possible, but you are not the householder here. you are a customer. You must be content with what diligence the staff shows and supplement it with watchfulness. You have learned not to blame individuals for a problem that belongs to the structure of life. The way wooden buildings and upholstery and curtains and the presence of many warm-blooded bodies create an ecosystem that includes more than we wish. Midnight arrives in the city in a series of practical ways rather than grand ones. It is when the last of the tavern talk drifts away and the clatter of pins in the mending basket becomes the only sound in the next room. It is when the candle burns low. Because tallow is expensive and must be saved for tomorrow's needs, it is when the chiming of a distant bell becomes a set of numbers rather than a song. You find yourself half between waking and sleep in that narrow alley where time thins and lengthens at once. The first bite has a sense to it that you recognize, not painful so much as precise. You do not flail. You move one hand to the edge of the sheet and press down, not to crush, but to steady yourself against the reflex to react. You practice the art of refusal, refusing to make this moment worse than it is. There will be another bite and another irritation, and these are not disasters. They are the price of the city's density. And you have paid that price before and will again. You might think that this is madness, to tolerate the intolerable, but you know that the alternative is exhaustion on a scale that makes the next day worse. In the morning there is work, even if your only work is to arrange the next cheap room or to walk to an appointment across town. The streets will be wet with yesterday's rain, and carts will pass and splash, and you will step carefully to keep your stockings dry. There will be news exchanged in a coffee house and a rumor of some new preparation said to kill everything in a wooden bedstead upon contact. A claim that makes your sensible mind skeptical and your tired mind hopeful. You will stand between those feelings and decide whether a few coins might be worth the experiment. You will also consider that a careful search and a kettle of boiling water achieve more than many bottles. The city is full of salesmen who understand how sleep deprivation softens judgment. You are determined to be a little harder to soften. You lie quietly. The curtain stills. The pillow has been turned once already to present the cooler side, an old trick and a good one. You have tucked the blanket under your feet because you do not like the sensation of a draft across your ankles. The wall beside you is not solid, stone but lath and plaster, and you can hear faintly, if you listen, the movements of someone rolling in another bed along the same wall. There is a shared time in lodging houses, a shared sense of night that binds strangers together who never see one another's faces. You wonder if the person you hear is sleeping well or ill, if the bed there is as old as this one, if the hangings there are a different color or a similar faded pattern. You let the wonder ride your breath. You count a slow measure. The itch peaks and then recedes to a tolerable irritation. This is the small grace of the human body, that it can adapt even when adaptation feels like surrender. You think one last practical thought before sleep. You picture the morning not as a sunrise, but as a list. Ask for a bed key. Retighten the ropes. Shake the sheets in the window light. Run a damp cloth with vinegar along the bedposts. Look into the joints where the frame meets. If the faint grit is there, pour water. Speak to the mistress of the house without accusation, with a tone that suggests you expect diligence and will pay fairly for it. Above all, remember that it is a system you are contending with, not a single night. The lodging house is not worse than any other. It is simply the current station on a long road of rooms. You have slept in worse and will again, and your standards have changed over time to reflect reality rather than ideal. Your body will take its rest where it can get it, and you will wake to the reality of the city, and you will do it all again. Because that is what it means to live in a century with so many wooden seams and so much human warmth to fill them. Before your mind lets go. the small rumor you expect to hear tomorrow returns. Someone has a new powder, they say, a new wash, a new smoke that clears a bedstead clean in a day. You have heard this before, and yet you are drawn to it, as you always are. Because hope is a function of tiredness as much as character. You wonder, in that last wandering way, whether anything truly new can be found against an old foe that knows your breath as well as you do. Or will the morning's coffeehouse promise turn into the familiar scent of vinegar and hot water by noon, and the same careful inspection at dusk, and the same bargain at midnight? Morning does not arrive like a fanfare. It collects itself quietly in corners and then takes the room by degrees. You wake not to a rooster or a bell, but to a resting of the city's weight into its daytime stance. The scrape of a pail on stone, a soft knock somewhere down the hall, the sigh of a door giving up the night draft. Your body registers the story of the sleep you just had in a private inventory, how many times you turned, whether your shoulder is numb from lying on one side too long, where the skin rises in a neat pattern of small annoyances that will fade after a wash. You sit up and watch the bed sort itself with you. The feather tick sighs as it reshapes. The rope lattice offers a creak as if protesting the weight lifted from it. And the linen, touched by your warmth, holds the imprint of your sleep in a way that is both intimate and impossible to avoid. The curtain's cloth smells faintly of dust and old smoke, not unpleasant, only inevitable. And when you pull it aside, a wedge of daylight answers every memory you held through the dark. Your first act is not to accuse the bed, but to tend to it. You've learned that beds, like people, respond to measured treatment better than to dramatic scolding. You smooth the sheet with your palm and then peel it back halfway, forming a folded border so you can inspect the seams. You look at the corners of the mattress tickware. It is stitched with that strong, looping hand that you could pick out of a basket of household mends by touch alone, and you pinch the fabric where it meets the rope edge. The rope has an earthy smell, a reminder that hemp and human sleep share close quarters. And in that border where soft things meet hard things, you find what you expected. The faint, gritty scatter that tells you where the night moved. It is not a discovery to ruin your day. It is the reason you get on with the day. You set the blanket back and let the linen breathe. Because a sheet that has forgotten your warmth is easier to boil clean when the laundress comes to carry it away. Downstairs, there is the kind of bustle that has meaning. The maid with the bucket meets the woman with the basket, and the house's economy passes hands in the form of tools that immediately do what they are meant to do. You ask for hot water, not like a lord demanding a bath, but like a person who knows the use of a kettle beyond tea. The mistress of the house nods and lifts her chin toward the back, where the kettle will be ready for anyone with sense enough to fetch it. She is neither apologetic nor indifferent. She lives in the middle register of the city's reality, where everything is used and cared for and rated as adequate or inadequate according to effort. While you wait, you ask for a bed key, and it arrives in a way you can trust, a worn piece of wood that fits neatly into the bed's rope knots and gives leverage to twist them tighter. The maid offers it without commentary, which is a comfort. No one here spans the gap between ignorance and shame. Everyone knows that a rope bed loosens. Everyone knows that a loose rope bed invites a night of rolling toward the middle. And that rolling toward the middle invites a proximity. That does not help your patience with other small burdens. You kneel at the bed's foot and work the key. With a practiced rhythm, numberless but patterned, twist, shift, twist, shift, hands remembering what words do not need to hold. As the ropes tighten, the bed gains the firmness that makes the linen look more crisp when it is laid back down. This becomes a morning ritual as much as washing your face at the basin, and in that way you realize how much of daily competence is a choreography with things. The mattress, when you lift it, protests with a small huff of feathers settling, and you tip the palliasse enough to see the underside of the frame. Wood meets wood at joins that have known years of slight movements. And it is there that you pour your first measure of boiling water when the maid returns with a steaming jug. The sound is quiet but decisive, a hush that makes you feel you have spoken to the bed in an intelligible language. You follow the joints up the posts and glance into the grooves of the carving, lingering in those areas where ornament becomes shelter. When the steam rises, you hold your face back and watch the way heat writes itself on the air. The hangings are serviceable and only slightly frayed at the lower edges, where boots have occasionally brushed against them. You pull them from their hooks and shake them once toward the window, a move that is half faith in air and half an acknowledgement that eyes cannot see everything. If the day were more generous with sun, you would carry them to a line outside. But today, there is only a spare light that does not promise much warmth. Still, the movement helps. You wipe the pole and the rings with a cloth dampened in vinegar. A trick you learned because it requires only that you keep vinegar in your possession. A simple thing that guards 100 uses. If the odor bites your nose, you accept it as proof of action. The window opens with a reluctant groan. You prop it for a half hour of sharp air to move through the room. It's a kind of air that encourages you to move while it insists on its own. Nature. Heavier methods, like sulfur burned in a pan. You hold in reserve strong measures are worth doing with deliberation and not on a whim between breakfast and noon. You go down to the common room, and while porridge, bread, and ale are set before you with the indifferent grace of a practiced hand, you listen. A lodging house dining room is a market of information as much as a place to take food. It sells. Not wares, but experience, and everyone in it has something to trade. Stories of stout remedies pass as easily as coin, and their value fluctuates depending on who tells them. A carter swears by a wash made from turpentine and spirits that he applies with a rag to the bed joints, insisting that the sharp scent is half the victory. A clerk recommends attentive candlelight inspection, followed by the patient application of a thin brush tipped with an oily mixture that flows into seams. An older woman describes an airing day in the country when all mattresses once lay on. Hedges open to wind and sun, while the family scoured bedsteads with sand and soap, and then left them to dry until the wood smelled of nothing but itself. You take in each testimony with the same receptive calm, weighing not only the advice, but the person behind it, their inclination to exaggerate, their pride in knowledge, their willingness to admit failure. You think about what happens to furniture. In this city, not in grand houses where generations pass down carved beds as heirlooms, but in the kind of places where wood is a companion more than a status. Brokers maintain yards where they acquire, repair, and resell items that have life left in them, and almost everything does, given the right repair and the right buyer. A bed passes from family to lodger, from lodger to another lodging house, and so on, until the making hands that first fitted the joints are long forgotten, and only the squeak of a particular board gives personality to the object. On this route, anything that lives upon or within the bed travels too. You can see the logic in why second-hand furniture sometimes costs less than its supposed quality suggests. Care is part of the price, and care must be supplied by the new owner. The lodging house's mistress knows this better than anyone, and you suspect that her mornings begin earlier than yours, with a walk through her rooms to make quiet corrections that forestall complaints. She does not want to hear loud tales at her table or watch a guest lift a blanket with theatrical disgust. She wants strong coin and a house with a reputation for honest housekeeping, which is the operative currency in this part of the city. When you return to your room, you patch the bed into order like a craftsperson finishing a morning's work. The ropes hold firm. The mattress sits square. The linen, refolded, is relaid with a smoothness that gives you satisfaction beyond utility. You push the bed a hair's breadth away from the wall. Not far enough to change the room's geometry, but enough to discourage traffic from the skirting board to the frame. You tuck the blanket so that it clears the floor by a finger's width. A petty barrier, but one that sometimes matters. You do not pretend these small attentions will make you invulnerable. You practice them because they reduce your surrender. To chance, you set your bundle on the chair rather than the bed, not because you fear fleas or moths more than bedbugs, but because you accept that leaps are possible and prefer to interrupt the possibility where you can. The city rewards this kind of calculation with a smoother path through the day, not because the day itself changes, but because you do. An errand takes you out. And as you walk the streets, you make analogies between the traffic of people and the traffic of pests. Not to sadden yourself, but to sharpen a principle. In the market, bolts of cloth hang in doorways, and they are handled by many hands. Upholsterers, those who trade in the comfort and display of households, work with horsehair, moss, and springs when springs begin to enter common use. And every layer they add to a chair or a couch provides more edges where small creatures can live if allowed. Household staff in large homes beat rugs over garden lines, sending out dust that coats hedges like an unseasonable bloom. Sailors in port bring back chests that have sat in cramped quarters where the wood swelled and shrank with weather, opening and closing seams. Meanwhile, under your feet, the alleyways carry runnels of water that serve as both freshening and filth, according to the hour. The city circulates itself, and in that circulation, both commerce and vermin find advantage. You accept it without bitterness, because bitterness is expensive energy. And reserve your will for real tasks. There are people who tell themselves that this is a problem of the poor, but you have seen too much to believe them. You have been in houses on fine squares where the bedstead posts are gilded and the canopy's brocade is bright as a theater curtain. And even there, the bed porter will lower his voice to admit that once in a while, on changing the seasonal covers, he finds what no one mentions at dinner. Wealth can purchase more linen, hotter water, more frequent attention, and can replace entire beds rather than simply treat them. It can commission a carpenter to take a frame apart and reassemble it cleaner with tighter joints. It can hire a specialist whose entire trade consists of visiting houses with sharp tools and keen eyes to seek hidden clusters, and still, even then, the old enemy slips through. You respect those who admit it and pity those who pretend they are exempt. For pretense shortens the list of effective actions while quietly extending the tally of nights disturbed by afternoon. When the day has settled and the light takes on that particular urban gray that both flattens and clarifies, you return to small experiments. You draw a slim circle of oil in a saucer and set the bed leg in it, a moat where a miniature boat will never float. You are careful that the blanket does not spill over the edge and render the barrier pointless. You rub a mixture you were told about vinegar with a whisper of oil into the underside of the frame, a compromise between the harsh scent of spirits and the blunt utility of something that coats and denies purchase. You consider smoke and decide against it today. Smoke lingers in fabric and in hair, and you do not want to carry the smell into your business with others. You promise yourself that, should a cold snap come, the excuse of extra warmth will justify a more aggressive fumigation. The bed repays attention with neatness, which is not the same as safety, but is its own comfort. Evening returns while the city prepares its two selves for the night, the public self of closing shutters and doused lamps, and the private self of rooms arranged for rest. You eat with the calm of one who has declared a truce with the day's anxieties. Upstairs, you light a candle long enough to finish your preparations. You draw the curtain not because it guarantees better outcomes, but because it changes your propester, your mind's relation to space, shrinking the field of concern to something you can hold. The sheets are cool again, and you begin the night from a different baseline than last night. made modestly more confident by the ritual attention and the knowledge that avoidance of panic is a technique as practical as any wash or scour. You let your breathing fall into an easy pattern and practice stillness, not as submission, but as a kind of discipline. And somewhere in the third stanza of your body's unspoken lullaby, the city pulls a blanket over its own shoulders. Yet even as you settle into this practiced peace, a practical question insists on remaining. If each day's careful work keeps the nightly adversary at bay for a time, is there any shift of habit, of building, of trade that might change? The contest from a nightly truce into a longer peace? Or will every generation in this city inherit the same pact and learn the same patient choreography? One rope twist and one boiling kettle at a time. The best way to end a recurring trouble is often not to chase a miracle, but to regularize the effort until it becomes so familiar that it ceases to feel like struggle. That is what the next weeks teach you, because in a lodging house you are not traveling through a single night. You are practicing a sequence. The house falls into its own cadence around you, and you learn its distinct flavor of diligence. Every third day, the maid makes a round with a bucket and a kettle, and those who wish can ask her to stop and pour along the bed joints. Once a week, the laundress collects sheets and pillowcases into a soft hill in her basket, and she returns them later with the faint stiffness that starch brings, a domestic luxury that announces both cleanliness and care. At a fortnight's regularity, the mistress herself tours the rooms with a sharp eye and a small hammer, tapping the frame joints to make sure the timber still sings the right note and the pegs hold as they should. None of these acts is dramatic, and that is precisely their power. You also grow more particular about the little choices that make you an accomplice in your own comfort. When the morning is bright and dry, you seize it. You draw the mattress to the window and set it on its side, braced so the light reaches into the creases you cannot flatten by hand. You shake the pillow outside over the sill and slap its sides with a measured vigor that makes a soft cloud of dust you cannot see until the sunlight reveals it. You run a cloth with vinegar around the frame while the bed stands open, and you let the air erase the sharpness before lowering the mattress again. You take notes in your head about which actions repay effort most. This work is iterative, not devotional. If you learn that oil motes are only useful when you patrol the blanket's edge, you decide whether the patrolling is worth the daily attention. If it is not, you put that method down and pick up another. Maintaining many small defenses is less important than choosing a few you can do thoroughly and regularly. Meanwhile, you listen to the city's broader experiment with remedies. And in listening, you learn something fundamental about human hope. A new powder is indeed touted at the coffee house one morning, described with convincing detail and a price that suggests seriousness without outright exploitation. The man recommending it has a reputation for fairness, so you buy a small measure and return to your room to test it. The powder sifts into seams and leaves a smell that you neither like nor hate. After 3 nights, you decide it helps in some places, does nothing in others, and that your own routines still deserve pride of place. You do not scorn the powder. It is one more tool among many. Another week, a small pamphlet appears at the print shop describing an old fumigation technique revived for modern use, complete with engraved instructions showing a bedstead surrounded by bowls and a pipe run into the frame by a clever arrangement of cloth and clay. You study it like a carpenter studying a new joint and commit its better parts to memory. The dissemination of instruction, you realize, is as important as the instruction itself. This is a lesson you see also in grander households. Passing into the orbit of a merchant's house for business, you notice how much of comfort comes down to organization rather than opulence. The bed in the family's main chamber is a matter of ceremony, tall posts, a rich canopy, velvet or damask hangings that change according to season. But the quiet success hides in what you do not see. The mattress aired on certain days without fail. The hangings removed often enough to be beaten in the courtyard. The bed cords inspected and retied on schedule. The household deploys a small army maids, a bed porter, a laundress whose precise tasks make a map of attention. When you speak with the steward about an unrelated matter, he mentions, almost offhand, that furniture purchased new is left to stand in a room apart for a fortnight before being placed in family chambers. Not out of suspicion of the maker, but out of respect for the reality that wood and cloth carry more than craftsmanship when they move through the city. These practices are not glamorous. They are simply wise. There is, too, the knowledge of how. Seasons shape the contest. In winter, with frost-edging window glass and a sharpness in the hallway air that tightens the throat, the bed's hangings work doubly hard. You learn to keep them drawn not only for warmth, but to maintain the microclimate that discourages movement at certain hours. The warming pan becomes less a luxury than a tool. And you mind the embers carefully because a wrong ember in the wrong place is a real danger. In spring, when dampness returns and the city's breath grows heavy, you air more often, boil more water, and accept that you will have a few rough nights as the year resets its routines. Summer brings both relief and challenge. The longer light helps your inspections, but warmth favors activity. And you redouble simple habits, pulling the bed a touch away from the wall, keeping the floor swept, the skirting board clear, and your garments stored away from the bed when possible. Autumn offers a lull that never announces itself. You discover it by surprise one evening when you realize a week has passed and your sleep has been almost entirely untroubled. In this time, you also learn from those around you whose lives are different, but whose solutions rhyme with your own. A seamstress who rents a corner room explains how she unpicks seams of her quilts each winter to wash and restitch them. Not because she finds the seam untrustworthy, but because she respects the seam as a thoroughfare. A journeyman carpenter shows you a small scraper he carries that fits neatly into bed joints for cleaning and smoothing. A simple tool that uses elbow grease rather than coin to improve things. A widow who keeps a small chandler's shop mentions, she warms her bed linens with the last heat of the day's candle making rather than building a separate fire, letting thrift double as comfort. These are not revolutionary acts. They are careful adjustments that take the friction out of nightly living. You gather them the way you gather spare buttons and useful string, not because each will solve a crisis, but because together they form a margin that protects you from the next sharp edge. Once, for the sake of comparison, you spend a few nights in a place that does not keep this cadence, and the difference is instructive. There the bed frame is handsome enough at first glance, but the ropes are slack and the mattress sags. The sheets are clean, but not quite rinsed free of soap. The hangings smell of stale room rather than aired fabric. The mistress smiles and speaks warmly, but her household's energy is turned toward the front parlor where guests are seen and not toward the rooms where guests sleep. It is not a scandal. It is a misallocation. You sleep poorly and your patience narrows, and you remember how quickly comfort unravels when handfuls of small things are left unattended. When you return to your original lodging house with its modest furniture and its determined routines, you feel an ease that has nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with reliability. Your gratitude is quiet and sticks with you through the next day's errands. In the end, the bed itself becomes your teacher. You come to recognize its sounds, its strengths, its requests. A particular creak at the left post signals a rope that will want attention in a day or two. A faint tilt toward the headboard suggests the floor has shifted with damp and that a shim beneath one leg will make the world level again. The mattress, when it lies flatter and does not puff after airing, indicates feathers that could use redistribution, or, if coin permits, a partial replenishing with a small sack from the market. The linen announces its needs, too. Not with words, but with wear and the familiar transparency that comes from long use and careful washing. You may, in time, purchase a new sheet, and when you do, you will keep the old one as a furniture cloth, generous with its service, even in retirement. Each adjustment makes the nightly bargain a little fairer. If there is a resolution to be found in this ordinary struggle, it is this: the nightly adversary does not disappear like a vanquished villain. It recedes into the fabric of ordinary life, where competence, patience, and habitual care keep it from swelling into crisis. Comfort is not the absence of irritation. It is the management of irritations so that the mind can rest. You will still occasionally wake to the distinct certainty that something small has found you despite your preparations. You will still sometimes rise at dawn to fetch a kettle and do the labor that allows for better nights. But instead of rage or despair, you meet these moments with the same stance you use to meet the city itself: pragmatic, attentive, and proportionate. You might be tempted, as you tidy the bed on a good morning, to declare the problem solved at last, to credit a particular wash or a special airing day for a streak of easy nights. You check yourself and resist the superstition. Better to say that you have learned how to live with a world that is not obeying you, but responding to your participation. You will move to other rooms, other houses, perhaps even other towns, and you will take this knowledge with you. You will pass it on to a friend in a quiet comment before bedtime, or to a child who helps tug the sheet tight, or to a landlady whose pride requires a suggestion disguised as a compliment. In this way, the memory of discomfort becomes a method that reduces discomfort for others. A small, unheralded civility spreads along with the more obvious trading of goods and coin. When you leave the lodging house finally, months later, you do not carry the bed with you, but you carry the skill of living with it. You can tell at a glance whether a frame is worth your time. You can feel with one hand whether a rope lattice has been tightened recently. You can smell the difference between air that has passed through fabric and fabric that is hung shut. Too long, you greet a room's flaws without drama, and you count off the moves that will make it yours for the night. If you are lucky, you will sleep the kind of sleep that forgets itself and leaves no trace but a smooth sheet in the morning. If you are less lucky, you will still sleep enough. The city remains unchanged in the truly large ways, but in the texture of your days, you have gained ground. And perhaps that is the quiet triumph available to anyone who has ever faced such a nightly challenge. Not that the old enemy disappears, but that you become the sort of person who can turn a rented room into a place of rest by habit and hand. Yet even as you step into the street with this competence tucked into your pocket like a well-used tool, you cannot help but wonder if entire neighborhoods learn to live by these steady, unassuming routines. Could the city itself become a place where sleep, while never perfect, becomes so reliably decent that the old stories about the nightly adversary fade into little more than a warning told out of tradition rather than necessity? Or will the next wave of moving goods and changing fashions invite a new pattern of seams and shadows and keep the bargain forever alive? You wake in a house that does not look like London, because here the horizon is wider and the trees press closer, and the rooms are arranged around fires that stand between survival and discomfort in a sharper way. It is a colonial household, neither grand nor rough, the sort of place built by hands that learned with each beam they lifted, and you can feel the difference in the bed before you see it. The ropes hold firm because someone here does not skip the weekly tightening. The mattress tick is stout, striped in the way many are, stitched with a hand that belongs to someone you likely know by name. The stuffed interior is a blend shaped by local conditions, a layer of straw at the bottom for bulk and dryness, a layer of feathers saved for years hoarded, not as luxury only, but as insurance against winter, and perhaps a layer of cattail fluff or dried moss where feathers are short. The sheet is linen because flax has been planted and retted and combed and spun and woven within walking distance of where you lie. In this house, almost nothing traveled farther than you did to arrive here. The bed is a piece of the room, not just a place to sleep. It sits near the hearth, not dangerously so, but close enough that warmth lingers on cold nights. In summer, it is pulled a little farther away, and the hangings are taken down because here people accept that seasonal life is sensible, not merely quaint. The hangings are plain wool in winter and lighter cotton in summer, dyed with something. The housewife can source walnut hulls or madder where fortunes permit, or left undyed when there are more pressing uses for time and money. The bed is higher from the floor than you might expect, but that height has purpose. It keeps you out of drafts. Gives storage space beneath 4 chests or a trundle bed for a child, and promises a small sense of separation in a house where rooms are few and tasks are many. In a corner, a bed key hangs on a peg, and the sight of it tells you more about the household's routines than any speech could. Weekly work here is as regular as a church bell. Monday is wash day by habit across many households because the week needs a beginning you can build around, and washing takes so much labor that it deserves pride of place. Water is heated in kettles that turn the kitchen air wet and sweet with wood smoke. Soap is a domestic product as much as any piece of furniture, made in small batches from lye, leached from wood ashes, and fats saved from cooking, sometimes with a scent added if the house has such a luxury. The sheets are boiled because that is the surest way to erase a week's intimacy, and after boiling, they are rinsed and wrung and carried out to dry in air that carries both the clean smell of sun and the more persistent smell of smoke that gets into everything. The mattress tick is not washed as often not because cleanliness is ignored, but because washing a mattress is an ordeal and is planned for only when necessary, at seasonal turns or when an incident forces the matter. In those in-between weeks, the mattress is aired in the sun, beaten, and brushed along seams. If vermin are a constant in cities, they are a familiar context here as well, though the methods of dealing with them bend to rural realities. The housewife, who knows every seam she has sewn, inspects those seams with a satisfaction that is equal measures pride and caution. She runs a thumbnail along the stitches and feels for grit, and if she finds what she expects to find occasionally, she does not clutch at drama. She heats water and pours it along the bed frame where wood meets wood. She scours the posts with sand when a rough patch appears, and sometimes she rubs a sharp-smelling wash over the joints that could be vinegar or a spirit distilled in the barn by a neighbor who still is as much a tool as the plow hanging in his field. Smoke is a tool here too, and if a particularly determined infestation shows itself, the room is prepared for a small fumigation with careful attention to windows and fire. Dried herbs may be burn sage, rosemary, where it grows. Sometimes tobacco leaves if someone in the house keeps them, and the smoke is let to creep into crevices while everyone steps outside for a while to let it settle its business undisturbed. Starch has a place in this routine that is both practical and emblematic. When the sheets are clean and almost dry, the housewife blends a modest starch from flour or purchased powder with water and works it into the fabric, not to make the bed smart for company, but to give the linen a crispness that resists the clinging of small things and makes dirt give up more easily when the next wash comes. The result is a sheet that is cool and firm, a modest luxury that declares a household's grip on its conditions. Toward evening, the warming pan makes an appearance, though here the pan might be a simple shovel wrapped in cloth used to slide. Embers under the covers and fairy heat in a safe loop that leaves the bed ready to receive tired bodies. The choreography is practiced and slow enough to prevent accidents, because everyone knows a story of someone else's carelessness with a coal. The people who sleep in the bed bring their own practices too. A man who works beyond the fields carries in more than the day's dust. He leaves his outer clothes hanging apart from the bed. Not out of daintiness, but because he respects the line between world and rest. A child who plays with a kitten in the afternoon learns to shake blankets before night because kittens find their way into places you do not want them. And so do other small creatures. A woman who spins by the window tells others that the best way to protect a bed is to keep the floor swept and the corners free of clutter. Because clutter is a harbor for all things that love absence of motion. This knowledge is not written anywhere. It moves across the room when one person teaches another how to tuck the sheet under in a firm fold, or how to set the bed slightly off the wall when summer comes, or how to lift and tighten the rope with the key until the bed feels like a boat that will not rock, even if you turn many times in the night in this house. New furniture is rare, which means repair is an art. The bed's rope wears where it rubs against the frame, and when that wear becomes a threat to sleep, the rope is remade or turned. A neighbor who can splice rope properly is as valuable as a neighbor who can shoe a horse. When a rope finally gives up its service, it might be reused in the barn or the garden. Nothing reaches the end of its usefulness without a hard trial. When the bed's joints loosen, a wedge of wood is tapped in, and the wedge holds more than the bed together. It holds the household's sense of agency. When the tick thins at one spot, a patch is cut from an old garment. A bit of strong cloth that traveled through years of other service. Before participating in sleep, markets are different here than in the city, and that changes the immune system of the house. There are fewer brokers who buy and sell furniture, by the dozens. Instead, a peddler might come by with a small variety of goods: a brass candlestick, a packet of pins, a yard of printed cotton, and in his pack, also a bottle he advertises as a cure for household pests. The price is not small, and the claims are tall. But you hear the housewife ask the questions that signal experience: how to apply it, whether the scent lingers, whether it harms fabrics, whether it must be used again next season. She weighs the price against the labor of boiling water and the ordinary effectiveness of vinegar. And only sometimes does she part with coin. When she does, she watches the results with the eye of someone who would rather be convinced by outcomes than by promises. As the week rolls toward Sunday, bed becomes almost a measure of time. Monday's sheets are clean and stiff with starch. Wednesday's bed smells faintly of sun from a midweek airing. Friday's rope gives the small sound that means it would like a little attention. And by Saturday evening, the bed is rearranged to accept a more restful night before the day of rest that is both spiritual and practical. On Sunday afternoon, with the house quieter, the mattress is thumped gently and feathers redistributed in a small rite of domestic engineering that relies on touch more than sight. A child might help, not because the work requires small hands, but because the child's future depends on learning these small assurances that no one will praise in public, but everyone will feel when they lie down to sleep. There are still nights when you wake to the sense of movement too small for light to catch. The remedy is not new. You keep the candle and the cloth nearby. You learn not to scratch wildly. And you remind yourself that vigilance has a beginning and an end each day. The end is needed because a person who allows the night's annoyances to swallow the day's strength has made a poor bargain. You choose to place your attention where it is most productive: in regular washing, in thoughtful airing, in the respectful distance between bed and wall, in the understanding that heat and light and movement are your allies. The old adversary is less a monster than a test of habits. When people here tell stories about beds, the most dramatic are usually about weather and fire, not insects. They speak of a winter so cold the sheets snapped with frost before it warmed, of a thunderstorm that forced everyone away from the window with a sudden gust that scattered drying laundry, of a neighbor's bed that caught a spark and threw the household into a night of fearful labors that ended in tears and gratitude. The adversary you share with all quarters is part of these stories in a quieter way. A subtext that strengthens the common understanding of how life is managed. Even when two houses disagree about theology or politics, they can agree on how to tuck a sheet or when to boil a kettle. The week ends as it began, not with triumph, but with readiness. The bed stands made with a certain intention and a visible modesty. The hangings are drawn or not, according to the weather. The floor is swept. The rope is tight. The joint at the headboard is clean. The sheet is cool and crisp and carries no scent but the clean one. You pull back the covers and slip between them with a sense of having participated in your own rest. And you ask the simple question that guides the next week as surely as any plan. In the realm of small, steady battles that make home feel like home, which practice will you add? And which habit will you refine to keep the night's small adversaries in their place tomorrow? By midweek, you can read the house the way you read a weathered map, by the marks that tell you where the work has settled and where it must go next. The bed is again your compass. On Tuesday, the sheets have lost the stiff crispness of starch and taken on the gentle give that says they have lived with you for a couple of nights. On Wednesday, the rope gives its small reminder groan when you sit, and you answer with the key before the day runs away with you. What you do is not complicated. What you do is persistent. You pull the mattress edge and look for that faint grit. You have learned not to dramatize. When you find it, you pour a little boiling water into the seam where wood meets wood. Not a showy sluice, just a steady thread that sends heat into the right place. You have adjusted your hand so often that you barely think, lifting the jug and lowering it with the patience of someone who has learned that control in small movements means control of the day. You keep the floor swept, not because anyone will judge you for a stray crumb, but because you suspect the crumbs, the dust, and the dreamy corners collect more than dirt. You take notice of the hemline of the hangings, dusting the lower few handspans where boots brush and where a stray flutter can make a small harbor. The bed is pulled a hand's breadth from the wall. You have accepted that no bed is an island, but you can at least make the passage from wall to bed require a decision. You shake the pillows at the window, where light helps you. The feathers move within their cloth bag like a small weather system, and you redistribute them by slapping and kneading, reminding the pillow what shape you want at the end of the day. You mark the difference between the practices that have a long tail of usefulness and those you might do only when the season presses. The oil-moated cup under the bed leg works when you mind it and fails when you get busy and the blanket spills. You allow yourself to be human and choose the practices you can repeat without failure. The household around you runs on a logic that makes the bed part of the economy rather than separate from it. Soap is precious and handmade, so you use it where it counts most and rely on boiling water where heat alone accomplishes the purpose. Vinegar is a pantry staple and a domestic ally. It swabs the bedposts and the joints, and it also brightens copper and rescues cooking smells that linger in the wrong places. You accept the sharp scent as a kind of badge, a little moment of bracing that announces you are willing to do what works rather than what impresses. Starch is not only for shirts and caps, it makes the sheet less hospitable and easier to wash. The next time, and if someone laughs that your bed rustles like a meaningfully folded letter, you smile and go on. You keep your senses tuned for the small peppery evidence of a nocturnal enemy, for the smell that tells you the hangings have been aired, for the note the rope plays when it wants a twist. You think a little, if you allow yourself, about how houses teach their people. A bed in a city teaches you about traffic furniture that circulates, bodies that arrive and depart. A bed here teaches you about maintenance tasks that recur and keep the edges of life smooth. You have learned to dedicate afternoons to sun when the sky permits it, to lean the mattress on a chair near a window and let light cut into the creases your hands cannot reach. You accept that the tick will be soon when it thins, and that a patch is a good story rather than a blemish. You remember that the rope will wear at the same rubbing points and that turning it or splicing a new length is not an admission of failure, but a mark of belonging in a house where things live with you. The bed does not ask for adoration. It asks for attention as steady as the seasons. Outside your door, you move through days that repeat with seasonal variation. And those seasons shape what you do for the bed in ways that feel like glad common sense. In winter, you keep the hangings up and tight for privacy and warmth and, yes, for the small climate that discourages the eager movement of those who prefer shadows. Though you also know that nothing favors them more than steady warmth unattended. The warming pan runs a careful circuit. The bed welcomes you without shock, and you sleep better for having made this an act with order. In spring, damp days ask for patience and more boiling water. The bed likes to be aired longer. The tick appreciates a thorough beating, and the joints answer to a scrub with sand and vinegar that leaves the wood newly ready for use. Summer invites you to take the hangings down, to reduce the number of folds where things can linger, to move the bed farther from the wall and let air rule the night. In autumn, you replace what was light with what will hold warmth, and you use the last strong days of sun for a full airing before the windows begin closing earlier. In this world, you meet neighbors whose methods enrich your own, and you assemble a community of solutions the way you might assemble a quilt. A neighbor who keeps geese teaches you to save feathers in small bags labeled by season, because feathers, taken at the right time, have a resilience that keeps your pillows loft longer. A woman who keeps bees tells you that the warmth of the hive house late in the afternoon can dry a sheet hung nearby in the evening. When the air still carries last night's damp, a man with a knack for rope shows you how to splice a fraying section into the bed line, a neat, strong join that sits smoothly in the frame. An old aunt insists the key to an untroubled bed is to teach children not to leap on it wildly, not because of manners, but because a bed that is sat and lain upon, rather than jumped upon, holds its shape and its joints better. You keep these pieces because you recognize that domestic wisdom is cumulative and local. Trade reaches even into a house that prides itself on self-sufficiency. From time to time, a peddler appears with a bundle and a voice trained in hopeful persuasion. He carries needles and ribbon and perhaps a bit of printed cotton that makes the heart quicken. And less romantically, he carries small bottles of something he calls a wonder. You no longer meet wonder with either cynicism or credulity. You ask him to describe how it is used, whether the scent lingers, whether the cloth is stained, whether the bottle must be bought again and again to keep the results. If his answers are vague, you spend your coin on pins and let him go. If his answers are practical and the price is not an insult to experience, you bring a bottle home and try it in one corner. Keeping everything else, you do the same, so that when you evaluate the bottle and not a change you made elsewhere. This habit of testing small variables is a discipline you did not know you were learning until you learned it. When you think of the broader landscape, you understand that the pressure of pests does not respect any single household's pride. Houses by the river contend with damp. Houses under dense trees contend with shade that slows drying. Houses near the busy road contend with dust that drifts into seams. A family who takes in boarders faces the traffic of goods and people. A farm that keeps seasonal workers watches the beds differently when new hands arrive. In some regions, enslaved laborers do the laundry and also carry knowledge from one place to another about what is worked. And their expertise shapes routines that the households lean on, even if the households do not speak of it plainly. You resolve quietly to notice where knowledge comes from and to credit it in your practice. If not in public conversation, then in the way you stand in the yard, breath fogging in cold air, and say to yourself that this method taught by that person, helped by Saturday, you often find yourself ready to work a little harder for a better Sunday. You lift the mattress and set it upright for a longer airing. You run fresh vinegar along the joints And you, if the day is fine, hang the hangings outside where sun can clarify the folds. You boil a kettle for the headboard joints and let it rest there long enough to heat wood rather than just wet it. If there is a scent you enjoy, a handful of lavender, a sprig of mint, you tuck it in the bedding not as a talisman but as a reminder that comfort includes the nerves and not only the skin. You rediscover how much a few hours of steady attention on a Saturday gives you back in the quiet of Sunday night when you lie down and the bed receives you with a confident, even feel, and the room holds the coolness you prefer. It is tempting, on weeks that go well, to imagine that you have solved a puzzle with a single key, but you have learned to resist that vanity. The adversary persists because the world contains seams and body heat and fabrics and wood. It is part of life's texture. Your aim is not conquest. Your aim is management. When a bite or two appears on your arm one morning, you note it and recall what you plan to do anyway, and you do not give the day more to the matter than it deserves. You save drama for weather and illness and harvest and births and the thousand things that really do require your higher energies. Meanwhile, you count it a victory that a house can be taught to prefer light and motion where shadow and stillness would otherwise seem comfortable to unwelcome guests. You accept that sameness is not dullness. Sameness is the habit that holds the day in a shape that allows rest. Sunday evening ends with the most ordinary of rituals. You turn the pillow, you tuck the sheet, you press the blanket smooth with the side of your hand so that it lies flat against your shin when you first stretch your legs. You lower the candle and watch its shadow draw the bed's edges on the wall. You listen without dread for the night's small movements and, hearing none, you let go. Hearing one or two, you let go anyway. The bed has become not the site of a battle but the site of your competence. And still, because life asks for hope as well as persistence, you ask yourself one more small, useful question before sleep. In a place where the only real magic is routine done well, which quiet change from? The way you air in spring to the way you fold in winter might bring next week's rest a breath closer to effortless. You do not notice the moment a routine becomes a culture. And then, one season, you look around and see that the house itself has learned you as much as you have learned it. The bed stops creaking unless it needs to speak. The rope, when it stretches, does so with enough notice that you tend to it before it sags. The hangings hold no secrets because they have no time to acquire them. Everything is ordinary, and the ordinariness is the achievement. You remember the first months when every day felt like interception catching. Small disasters before they expanded, and you compare them to the steadier period when you correct earlier than the danger line and move on. It is a relief not registered in words, but in the way your shoulders settle lower in the evening. When you sit at the bed's edge to unlace your shoes, inevitably though, a trial comes that tests the system. It is not melodramatic, it is simply real. A relative arrives for a stretch of months with a trunk that has crossed miles of rutted roads and the decks of more than one boat. And the trunk has a life of its own in its seams. The first week passes without anything more than the usual minor attentions. The second week introduces a pattern on a wrist that your experienced eye does not dismiss. You open the trunk and you look with the caution of someone who understands. That inspection is not accusation. You find the signs where you expected, in the seam of the lining and in the small tear mended with haste some seasons ago. You do not scold. You set the trunk in the yard on a clear day when the sun is honest and high. You bring the kettle, the vinegar, the patience. You brush the seams with a stiff brush. You pour boiling water with precision. You decide to leave the trunk open for 2 days rather than 1, and you make the spare room, the place where the trunk will live until it shows itself to be a neighbor and not a foreign agent. The bed in your own room becomes the beneficiary of this extra vigilance. You pull it farther from the wall for a week. You increase the frequency of airing. You lift the mattress edge each morning in a practiced sweep. The household rallies. Without fuss, the laundress agrees to add an extra boiling to the week's work. The children are told, without fear, that the trunk is not to be climbed in or upon. The relative, who brings good stories as well as useful knowledge, shares a trick learned from someone further downriver about using hot sand in a cloth to rub the joints once they have dried from boiling. The friction adding a measure of cleansing. Where water alone may have missed, you try it and find it sensible. You mark down in your mind the difference between useful novelty and mere novelty. And you store the hot sand idea in your now well-stocked cabinet of practical answers. You choose this moment to reassess the bed tick, because a stress in one part of the system is a nudge to strengthen other parts. You roll the mattress out, slit a seam with the same careful hand that once stitched it closed, and you let the feathers see the light. Not all at once, and not in the wind, but in measured portions that you shake free of dust and redistribute, discarding the clumps compacted by years of pressure and sweat. You save the sound feathers and add a small bag purchased last market day. A modest investment that feels both sensible and slightly celebratory, like mending a good coat with a small patch of better cloth. You re-soothe the tick in a line that will be strong under strain. And you feel again that pride that does not announce itself but stands quietly near the edge of your sleep. When you lie down that night, if you grew up in a house where talk settles around proverbs, you can hear the one that applies now when the wind rises. Check the shutters and the roof, not the pepper pot. You have applied it here. The trunk set off a little squall. You check the bed and the routines. The squall passes, as most do when they are met with measured competence. The relative, embarrassed at first, comes to appreciate your steady approach and offers a gratitude that is more valuable because it is unsentimental. The children learn a lesson about what enters a house and how a house politely but firmly establishes its terms. If any of this sounds grand in retelling, you know it was mundane in action kettles. Cloths, sunlight, a well-timed refusal to panic. There is another kind of test, too. The seasonal kind that presses on a system simply because everything accumulates. At once, late spring brings rains that do not wish to leave, and days stack up in a column of damp that makes the air feel busy and the cloth slow to release its moisture. This is when you find out whether your ordinary measures are enough. You air in the hours between showers. You bring beds closer to the fire where you can without inviting sparks. You stretch hangings across chairs overnight near the stove's dying heat and turn them before bed so the opposite side sees its hour of drying. You rub the bed joints with vinegar and a little spirit and accept that you will repeat the rubbing. More often than usual, you do the extra things without losing track of the basic ones: boiling, scrubbing, tight ropes, modest distance from walls. You come out the other side of a wet fortnight, pleased that the bed never turned into a harbor. When you look back, the climax of this story, if you are obliged to tell it that weighs not a great fire or a pitched battle, but a subtle shift in power. You have taken ownership of the nightly conditions. The nightly adversary has not been banished. It has been contained to the level of irritation that your body and mind can absorb without injury. The bed is still a machine of many materials: rope, wood, straw, feather, linen, and each has its vulnerability, but as a system they now answer to your rhythms. If someone visiting raises an eyebrow at the vinegar smell or the sight of hangings on a line on a bright day, you do not bother with explanation unless asked. If asked, you answer gently, because you remember a time when you thought the problem was a moral failing rather than an engineering one. Your last acts before sleep, on a particularly good week, are almost ceremonial in their simplicity. You pat the mattress where your shoulder will lie. You turn the pillow. You lift the sheet a moment to catch the cool air and let it settle again. You imagine the kettle on the hook, the bed key on its peg, the brush by the window, and you feel the kind of comfort that comes from tools being where they belong, ready to be used without a speech. You drift off with the sense that you are not at the mercy of the night, and you wake with the uncomplicated feeling that the bed did its work while you did yours. No one writes ballads about such victories. You would not want them to. The point is not applause. The point is sleep. When you speak of these months later, maybe to someone just starting a household, you do not dramatize. You list gently and in order. Boil the linen, air the mattress, tighten the rope, wipe the joints. Keep some vinegar, keep some patience, and let the sun see the inside of things as often as the weather allows. You do not pretend that one bottle or one day will deliver a permanent cure. You encourage the newcomer to find a cadence that fits their house, their wind, their walls, their water. You tell them what someone once told you, that discomforts are easier to manage when they are familiar, and that unfamiliar discomforts appear less often when the familiar habits are kept. You end. If you are inclined to end things with a question, with the one that matters most here, and you place it where it will be remembered just when the candle is being snuffed and the sheet is being lifted. If the true measure of comfort is not luxury, but reliability, what quiet habit will you choose tomorrow that makes your bed and therefore your sleep something you can trust even when weather, work, and the world test every seam you have so carefully sewn? You step beloudix as the ship settles into its evening breath, and the air changes the instant the last foot of sunlight retreats from the companionway. The space between decks is a world of wood and rope and tar, and it lives by a schedule that the sea enforces without negotiation. You will not find a bed in the way you think of a bed on land. You will find a hammock, your own if you are fortunate, slung from hooks driven into beams that have seen years of swelling and shrinking with water and heat. The hammock is canvas, hard-wearing and stiff at first until the shape of your body and the rhythm of your nights persuade it to fold differently and cradle better. You stow your belongings in your sea chest and your hammock net, and you learn quickly that what shares your berth with you is never only what you packed. A ship is a confined city, moving, and its geometry directs not just bodies, but also the small life that rides upon bodies and wood. Between decks, beams and knees meet in joints that can be plain smooth but still provide 1,000 edges. And the planking overhead is a map of seams, caulked with oakum and coated with tar, and sometimes paint, depending on the ship's habit and the Navy's purse. The personal space allotted to you is measured not in meters, but in the distance between two hooks. And into that interval falls the life you will lead for weeks or months. At the change of watch, you swing up your hammock or you unroll it, and the motion itself becomes a small ceremony that ends in the awkward grace of settling in while the ship tilts. The first nights, you overthink your balance. Later, your body knows how to lie diagonally and let the hammock do what it was made to do, keeping you from being thrown and lifting you off the wet deck. You live by calls and bells. Rum is issued, supper is dealt, lanterns swing, and then the order comes for down hammocks, and the beams fill with canvas slings shaped by sleep. The senior men have spots they prefer: less spray, less draft from an open hatch, fewer footsteps underneath from the gun deck if the ship is large enough to have one. The younger ones take what is left and learn to make it work. You are instructed by example as much as by words to air your hammock at every chance. In the morning, at up hammocks, the deck clears in a flurry of practiced movements. Hammocks are lashed into tight rolls, stowed in nettings along the ship's sides to serve as makeshift bulwarks against shot. And the space becomes workable again for the day's routines. That habit of lashing and stowing matters for cleanliness as much as readiness. A wet folded hammock grows a set of problems that will make you miserable before a week has gone by. Below, where the warmth is steady and the light is uneven, you begin to learn the inhabitants of the ship other than the obvious ones. Rats you know about without looking. You hear their feet and see what they have found to chew when the candles are low. Lice you know by the itch that finds the seams of collars and the edges of waistbands. Bedbugs, different in their preferences, have a talent for finding the seams of canvas and the edges of slings. The lashings where your hammock lines meet the canvas, the tongues and grooves where the beams are joined. They arrive from ports, from the chests of green hands who pack their lives in with their shirts. From dockside lodging houses, from the hard tokeling corners of the ship that no amount of holystoning ever quite renews. They are small, flattened, and stubborn. You become a practical biologist without any need for Latin. Learning patterns by experience because that is what the sea teaches you. Some nights are gifted by a wind that keeps every part of the ship ventilated and cool. Other nights press heat against the beams like a hand. In the worst calms, when the sails hang and the deck turns into a stew of smell star and salt and old wood and bodies and the tale of last night's supper, the pests are livelier and you are less tolerant. You learn that a still ship is a harder bedfellow. You sleep with your shirt open or your sleeves rolled, depending on who you are and what the officers will permit. And you arrange the hammock to give a little more air without exposing yourself to the drip from above that can cold shock you into a cough if the night runs long and the dew refuses to sit quietly. You tuck your blanket, if you have one, so that it does not hang over the side and make a bridge for the very creatures you hope to keep away. You watch your neighbors' methods and borrow from the sensible ones. Discipline at sea has a purpose beyond order. It is a method of health. The decks are scrubbed with salt water and sand in the morning, holystoned until the planks shine pale and smooth. The buckets, the pumps, the lines themselves are cleaned with attention, not because anyone is trying to impress, but because born-in crews have learned where rot begins and where filth causes weakness. In this system, your hammock is not private beyond the length of a forgiving glance. An officer or a senior man will tell you if the stitching is going and you will mend it. And if your hammock smells of neglect, you will fix that at the next opportunity. The same standards apply to vermin. You do not pretend they are not there. You manage them to the point where they are part of the background annoyance rather than the headline misery. It is said often enough to become a proverb without anyone calling it one. The sea will give you work enough. Do not make more for yourself. On shore leave, you court a different risk. Lodging houses in port are famous for their economy of care, and a single night's rest in the wrong bed can undo weeks of careful shipboard habit. You learn to look at a mattress the way you look at a sail, by its seams, by its repairs, by how it lies between supports. You listen to those who have been in this port before. Is there a public house whose rooms are tended by a woman with the right kind of pride? Is there a longer walk that delivers you to a bed fewer men have used this week? You pay attention, not so much to the grandeur of the front room as to the smell of the stair, the condition of the bed rope, the willingness of the keeper to provide a kettle if asked. You discover again the small politics of sleep, which are always more about the innards of things than the surface. For some, the solution is to sleep on deck when allowed, under the gunwales or near a coil of rope, with a jacket under the head, and the sea's moving air for relief. It is not a luxury. Rain will find you, and spray will make you cold in a way that does not leave quickly. But on some nights, the trade is worth it. You also learn the trick of airing your blanket by looping it once around the shrouds in late afternoon sun, in sight of the officer of the watch, who accepts the sight because it keeps his men in better temper at night. The surgeons aboard practical. Men with limits point out what everyone knows. A man who sleeps tolerably fights and works better than a man who scratches and swears all day. That is not medical philosophy. It is daily arithmetic. The language aboard acquires specialties. Hammocks and down hammocks bookend your day. Grog marks a time, and hands to clean ship is a prayer in a way, because a clean ship is a sound one. Into this daily round, you fit your own small countermeasures. You rub the seams of your hammock with vinegar or a strong spirit when you can get it. Not because you think it is a miracle, but because you know contact along those edges happens night after night. You turn your hammock inside out occasionally, letting its less exposed surface see light and air. You check the lashings because frayed lashings are both a danger to your body and a signal to any creature that prefers a rough rope to a smooth one. You become the kind of person who sees a seam differently forever. On a fair night, when the ship breaths easy and the crew is in better humor, you might even feel the hammock's advantage over the wooden bed. The way it isolates you above the deck's unkind inhabitants and rocks in a cadence that whispers of safety. The hull groans, a friendly complaint. The water moves against the ship as if gently rehearsing a song you have almost learned. In that lull, you begin to believe you might sleep through until the next watch without the kind of interruption that makes a man roll out, rubbing his forearms and muttering imprecations to the beams. And yet, because you have already accepted reality, you keep a cloth and a bit of oil where you can reach them even in the dark. And you make your peace with the idea that being ready is not a sign that trouble must come, but simply a sign that you live sensibly under wood. If the sea teaches one lesson over and over, it is that conditions are always moving and you must move with them. You fall asleep thinking of wind and tide, and think instead, perhaps, of a simpler, quieter variable. On the next calm, when the hammocks will be more challenged by heat and still air, which small change and extra airing, a longer vinegar rub, a stricter watch on bridging blankets, will shift the night from grudging to acceptable without drawing the eye of a mate who dislikes. Seeing too much private enterprise on his deck, you discover quickly that the ship has its own pharmacopoeia, not of bottles gleaming like a shop, but of practices that sit ready in the routine. The most basic is the order that everyone understands without elaboration. Air your hammocks. Sun and wind are denied commodities below, lavish above. When the weather allows, hammocks are slung over lines strung along the rigging or spread at the waist so that light can do what heat and vinegar alone cannot. You learn the difference between a hammock that has been truly aired and one that was merely taken out and brought in again. And that difference is not a matter of appearance, but of how it feels against the skin when you tuck your shoulder into it. The sailmaker, a man you once thought only tended canvas and thread for the ship's working face, becomes a person you respect for instructing younger hands in how to rinse a hammock properly in fresh water when scarce, and salt water when that is all there is, and when to beg the cook for a pot that will hold a boiling and drive out a week of itch. There is, too, a regimen of smoke used with attention. The between-deck space can be fumigated when the officer of the watch deems it worth the trouble. And it is a trouble. Fires do not belong below, so the remedies are managed in ways that use heat without open flames where wood would be quick to complain. A pan is charged and smoldering materials, sometimes herbs, sometimes tobacco stem, sometimes stronger measures set to give off a smoke that creeps into places your fingers cannot reach. Men move up. Hatches are opened in such a way that the smoke holds its course before it runs into the sky. And the lingering smell is tolerated because everyone slept better after the last time. You keep your hammock aside on those days. Let the smoke have the beams and seams, and then return later to make your small inspection. Scrubbing, the unglamorous cornerstone, continues its daily claim on strength. Holy stoning decks is a morning. Prayer to dryness and order. The same sand that smooths planks gets into the joints where pest and rot would find hope and denies them. You learn to respect the carpenter's ear. He taps beams and hears more than you do, notes when a joint sounds dull and asks for attention, and in tending to strength, he often also tends to cleanliness. A tight joint gives fewer homes. You begin to see how the ship's structural health and your own skin health are linked, and that is not just philosophy. A sound ship has fewer places where dirt collects and fewer excuses for neglect. Clothes, too, are part of the equation. Shirts washed and dried hard in the wind carry fewer passengers. You let your breeches see the sun inside out so that the seams, which the skin knows as a line of irritation on long watches, are less friendly to any creature that looks for a place to wait. Hair matters as much as cloth. Short hair holds less. Trouble-powdered wigs are the business of officers and not of you. A cap kept clean becomes more than habit. It is a barrier kept in good repair. The barber's work in cutting is part of hygiene, and the ship knows it. The surgeon, who watches for plague and fever, approves of anything that helps his sick bus stay emptier. And if he cannot banish bedbugs, he at least banishes the worst excuses for letting them thrive. Shore practices flow aboard in miniature. Spirits vinegar most often are applied to seams and to the underedges of the hammock where the canvas folds double. The bosun frowns on anything that soils the deck or wastes stores, but he accepts a cloth well wrung and a hand that knows how to be thorough with little. Men who have seen other navies bring tricks with them that are judged less by their national origin than by their evident effect. A dab of tar in a troublesome crack. A temporary cover over a beam seam until a carpenter can address it properly. A habit of hanging hammock clews so that the rope does not brush a dirty surface when the ship heels. You become a borrower of other men's experience the way you might borrow a better knot. You also learn how infestations develop stories when they reach beyond tolerable. A calm ocean, heat, a ship loaded heavy, and suddenly the night's gain. Resentment that turns restful men sour. That is when officers will set a general airing day, turning the ship into a clothesline and canvas yard. Hammocks and shirts and jackets and blankets flapping in a floating village of laundry. It looks a little ridiculous to an eye trained to admire warlike neatness, but the experienced eye sees health and morale being repaired. In port, if there is time, men are allowed to take their gear ashore to wash properly in fresh water. On the return, the inspection at the gangway matters as much as a return from a tavern. Is your gear dry? Is your hammock aired? Do you have more in your chest than you went ashore with that crawls? A younger hand asks now and then whether it is possible to rid the ship entirely of the old adversary. You do not snarl. You answer as you were answered. The sea is not a sterile place. Ships are wood and rope and grease and cloth, and men sweat and breathe and bring their histories aboard. The question is not, can we make it never happen? But can we keep it where it does not matter? It is an arithmetic of tolerances. If the itch is occasional, if bites do not raise two angry welts that keep a man from standing his trick at the wheel or his quarter at a gun, if men do not wake snarling at each other for lack of rest, then the measures are in balance. If they are not, then the ship's routine tightens. More airing, more scrubbing, less indulgence ashore in beds that look soft but are treacherous. Officers have their own worries. In their cabins, paneled and better aired, upholstered seats and partitions offer comfort and more seams. Upholstery is a luxury and a maintenance burden. A sensible officer orders the hangings struck and aired, the cushions beaten, the cabin washed with the same vinegar used forward. And he does not care if this makes him less ornamental. He knows that ease bought at the price of nightly misery is no ease. The captain himself, if wise, inspects the men's space as well as his own, less to catch out offenses than to catch issues before they become offenses. He knows that a crew that sleeps is a crew that obeys in the gale and fights with clear vision. Stories circulate, as stories will, about extraordinary remedies tried on other ships. One man swears that brimstone burned in a particular manner made a gun deck livable in the tropics. Another insists a German fellow had a wash that killed everything that looked at it. You listen and, when you can, you test on a small scale, because faith at sea is not the kind that throws stores overboard. When something works, it becomes lore, and then policy. When it does not, it becomes a cautionary tale filed alongside. Stories of navigational bravado that ended with a keel on a sandbank. You learn to enjoy the telling without letting it steer your hand. By the time you have spent some months at sea, the hammock is no longer a curiosity. It is your bed, and you carry knowledge about it you did not have when you stepped aboard. You know how to tie it so your weight lies as a diagonal that resists being flung. You know how to set your shoes beneath and your jacket over the end, to dry in a way that does not spin moisture back into your sleeping cloth. You know how to keep a cloth and a tin of something sharp-smelling tied in a small bag to use on the seam when a run of warm thaw. Still nights appears in the forecast your bones make of the air Balautic. You operate not as a victim of the ship, but as a component of it. You end another long watch with shoulders heavy, stepping down to the space that is yours, and you sling the hammock the way your hands now do without thinking. You intend to sleep. You intend to let the ship rock you, the slow pendulum that steals years and gives them back again. You also intend, because the sea insists on pragmatism, to make one small change to meet the next week's weather on your terms. Will you choose to hang the hammock a touch higher for air under your back, to rub a little vinegar into the clews with a cloth as you lash them, or to join the push for a general airing if the next day's sky comes blue? Which choice will buy you the kind of sleep that turns a hard job into a tolerable one without turning your captain's eye into a frown? It takes a gale and a return to calm to show you what the hammock has really taught you. In the days when the ship climbed and fell again, when men stayed long in their wet gear and the air below took on a salt-wet heaviness, no candle could sweeten. Sleep came in snapshots, and you took what you could. The hammock swung violently, and you tucked yourself into your canvas cradle to keep from being hurled. And the biting things were the least of your worries. When the wind fell and the decks were rinsed of spray at last, when the pumps did their insistent work and the crew fell into a pattern of repair, you discovered that what returns first, when the world stops heaving, is the capacity to be irritated by small things. Out of that irritation, you organized. The order went, air hammocks. Men obeyed as though waking from a trance. The lines filled with white and dun cloth, and a floating village of beds breathed for the first time in a week. The ship, a practical animal, rebalanced after the storm. Repairs went forward in a schedule that made you glad you belonged to a practiced machine. The carpenter replaced tree nails and chalked beams. The sailmaker patched rents. The boatswain bullied and coaxed running rigging back to loyal service. And among these larger restorations, you performed your own. The bed that is not a bed but a swinging length of canvas reclaimed from wet, heat, and the unnoticed accumulation of nights. You scrubbed, and you did so with patience rather than rage. You let the sun do its work. You learned for the 100th time that half the cure for what lives in seams is to let the seams see light. It is in the after days that the small reforms take root. The officers, reminded of how quickly misery accumulates, indulge more frequent general airings. The cook, whose domain is heat, allows a pot now and then for boiling gear that will pay him back in men who work better. The surgeon hints to the first lieutenant that men who sleep less itch, scratch less scab, and therefore fill fewer cots and cost fewer medicines. Policy, such as it is aboard a wooden city, aligns briefly with comfort, and you hold on to the improvements as long as memory can hold discipline. A shore leave in a new port becomes a test of everything you have learned. You look at the lodgings with a stricter eye than before. You choose a cot in an airy room rather than a soft tick in a corner that smells like someone else's night. You hang your shirt and blanket, not over the bed, but from a line you rig. Between two nails, you convince the landlord to let you use. You refuse politely or not to stack your sea chest under the bed. You stand it on its own legs and let the light strike its seams. You carry the habit back aboard, less as a superstition than as a personal policy that travels with you. The ship does not stop moving when the anchor is down. The tides of men and goods move aboard and ashore. And you turn your knowledge into a small breakwater against what tries to wash in. You also come to understand the difference between different ships' cultures, and how much nightly comfort blooms or withers under leaders who see what you see. A captain who insists on cleanliness is a better captain than one who adds an extra allowance of rum. A first lieutenant who counts the days between general hammock airings is a man who will also count the days between victualling errors. You discover that leadership trickles down into sleep. The ship with tidy beams and ordered hooks with nettings that do not become junkyards is a ship where the nightly adversary remains an annoyance rather than a tyranny. This is not romance. This is wood, cloth, bodies, and attention. In your own hammock, in your own body, you measure the outcome without philosophy. You either sleep and wake to the bells ready, or you do not. You prefer to. So you continue the small acts, rubbing seams, not letting blankets bridge to the deck, airing in any sun, reminding your messmates with a jaunty word when sloth threatens. Men forgive the man who nags for a shared good when the proof is a fewer number of midnight curses and a lazier scratch in the early morning instead of an angry one. You translate care into humor where you can, and into habit where humor does not carry. There will be voyages, long and hot, where the ship becomes a hothouse of irritations, and no routine quiets them entirely. There will be anchors dropped in places, where damp eats at the planks and men grow peevish. There will be storms that make all beds useless for days. You do not pretend otherwise. In such stretches, you reduce your aims. Keep the hammock aired when any breeze allows. Keep the seams from becoming towns. Keep your body as clean as fresh water allows. Keep your temper. The adversary thrives on neglect and on the kind of despair that says the job is too big. You deny it both. Your denial is neither stubbornness nor mysticism. It is the practical courage of rope and kettle translated into canvas and routine. When the commission ends, and you walk down the gangplank for the last time, your shoulders straighten under a sky that does not move, and your feet surprise you. By missing the deck's irregular rationale, you sleep ashore in a bed that looks generous, and for a moment you distrust it. You look at its seams, at its ropes, if it has them, at the distance between it and the wall, at the hangings. You keep the habit of airing and of asking for a kettle. You continue to feel the ghost swing of the hammock as you lie still. Bedbugs, which belong to no class and obey no flag, will find you ashore as well as afloat. The difference is that you will not be surprised by them again. You will hold the line at tolerable. It is a small power to carry into the rest of your days. When you teach a younger man in a boarding house years later how to inspect a mattress seam with a thumb and a cloth, you will sound like the men who once taught you how to work a halyard or a sheet. When you sit with a friend and talk about weary nights, you will not complain about fate. You will ask what he does with his gear, how he keeps his bed from becoming a thoroughfare. You will realize that the sea's discipline, reduced from its harshness and kept for its wisdom, can live in a land bed as well as in a swinging sling. You do not clutch a final moral. You ask a final question, the kind that fits in the pocket with your knife, now that you have learned to make even a moving, crowded, wooden world grant you a minimum of rest by steady habit. Which parts of that habit will you bring ashore, and which will you let go, so that your sleep on land is not a naive surrender, but a continuation of the same quiet, competent truce? You also notice changes in your own expectations. Where once you judged a room by its fabrics, you now judge it by its preparedness. A lovely bed that is hard to tend is less appealing than a well-made bed that submits to cleaning. You find yourself preferring designs that allow rods to be dismounted without drama, hangings to be unhooked without tearing, and mattresses to be lifted without a second person. You become a patron of the kind of craftsmanship that respects maintenance, and in doing so, you contribute to an economy that rewards practicality. The city, which often performs for the eye, also quietly caters to the hand that cleans. In the end, resolution looks very much like beginning, only practiced and secure. The bed in your room is poised between display and plain usefulness, and the balance is kept by the boring acts that, in private, feel satisfying. You no longer lie awake planning campaigns. You lie down and fall asleep because the structures for your rest were completed in the daytime. When a new risk appears, you do not become a zealot. You become the centered person in the room, the one who opens a window, who asks for a kettle, who lifts a curtain and looks, who finds the seam and rubs it, who suggests a discreet delay before an inherited peace is installed. You model calm competence, which spreads more quietly and effectively than any sermon. On a quiet night, the city outside sighs. You drift toward sleep with a last thought that is not quite a rule, but not merely an idle hope. If beauty without maintenance is a mask, and maintenance without beauty is a scold. What habits will you choose in the coming months to keep your bed lying between those two impostors? A place where you rest without pretense and without neglect, even as Paris continues its playful work of making complications look effortless.